what I'm going to try to do is to talk about the kind of things that I think maybe we could be talking about. And I'll do this since I, in thinking about this, anticipated that many of, if not all of you, one way or the other, many of you in here are either involved in teaching now or will be in some future moment, and certainly training to do so for the PhD students here. I thought I would talk about this from a pedagogical point of view, the general issues that have been put on the table by the show. And more to the point, I mean, also because Columbia, because Columbia is somehow, between the lines of some of this discussion, Columbia of a particular moment in which I was only somewhat partly implicated, but nevertheless implicated, and have remained, with which I've remained implicated. It might be an interesting thing to speak institutionally also, because there is no teaching one way or the other without institutions of some kind. So here we are in Wood Auditorium at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in a lecture course. It's a required lecture course, so you are, most of you would hypothetically at least be first-year students in the Master of Architecture program at Columbia, for whom this course is now required as of this past semester. The name of the course is Architectural Visualization since 1900. Actually, that's not really the name of the course. That's the name that I gave to the part of the course for which I'm responsible, because this is a component in a larger project or effort in which we have tried to, we meaning in this case more specifically I and my colleague Laura Kurgan, who is a director of visual studies at Columbia, the courses in which the techniques and the thought, the sort of hands-on practice of what I would prefer to call visualization rather than representation or drawing or something, is taught. And that's typically, at Columbia now that has, and I think this is true in many places, those kinds of courses have been bridge courses vis-a-vis studio. This course, this is this kind of course within a course in a sense, the lecture, the history lecture, is also meant to bridge. I actually I initiated this course independently as just an elective lecture. It was just open to anybody, and people took it. I taught it once the year before, and in response to basically the mainstreaming, the kind of institutionalization, not only of digital techniques and discourse and so on, but of the concerns that have certainly returned to the architectural curriculum, largely in response to this transformation of how we visualize both the world and the objects that architects produce through that world and in it. So I thought it was sort of high time for a history course directly addressing this subject one way or the other. So then in conversations with colleagues and primarily with Laura, it was actually, they proposed that it be required, and so we tried that out. So we just tried that out for the first time this past spring. It's very much a work in progress. And so what I thought I would do is try to just put this on the table, put the thing on the table, the premises, the hypothesis, just a few glimpses of the structure of the course, mainly in its main arguments, or at least its main theorems, as you see, and without much comment, I hope, but as some kind of a context for this. Now, to do that, so I've told you that it's a required course. It's also an elective course for people who are doing other things. We have many programs, the AAD program, and so on. So people who are interested in this subject can also take it. But it really is in the process, at least, and I'll show you the syllabus, and you'll see if this is not complete, this process. in the process of being shaped as a first-year Master of Architecture core lecture course. And as such, I have taught and insisted in the sense that this course has two pedagogical and epistemological aims. Epistemological in the sense of helping us to know what we know and to think about how we know what we know, as well as to teach, historical information and so on. Now the first one is to outline a semi-technical history of architectural visualization in what we can call the long 20th century. Actually, it's the 20th century that begins in the even mid 19th century in some senses, and certainly in the late 19th century with the Beaux-Arts, and extends to the present one in one degree or another. To outline this history in a way that rearranges or at least addresses our assumptions regarding that century's supposed phases, the sequences, modernist, postmodernist, etc. And in that sense, and this is also the more direct reaction or dialogue with Greg Shaw, is that what I'm about to describe for you is more of a genealogy than it is an archaeology. And here I'm using these terms somewhat technically, mostly through the language and work of Michel Foucault, for whom archaeology, and it was the sort of source for most of the archaeologists of media and so on that speak like that about technology and about media. So archaeology, what Foucault means by archaeology is similar. It's basically what you've got here is a kind of cross section, a synchronic cut through a period or a moment. I mean, I'm trying to simplify this for clarity, but that maps, in Foucault's sense, the system of rules governing what is thinkable in a given discursive formation. The rules of the grammars, the often unstated assumptions, grammars, structures, patterns of thought. Genealogy, which is a later idea of Foucault, maps the contingent factors that condition the movement from one formation to another. So that changes the movement from one phase to another. So it's more or less diachronic. So genealogy is more of a diachronic, kind of, it's not necessarily chronological, but it certainly involves chronology in a way that archaeology doesn't necessarily have to do, at least to this. If you think about an archaeologist excavating a particular layer in the kind of sedimentations of history, genealogy cuts in a section, like kind of cross-section through the layers. So in that sense, in response to an archaeology of the digital, a genealogy of the digital. But even there's some sort of let's say some cautions, because one doesn't, especially in an introductory lecture course, these have ways of being overdetermined, especially in Columbia. They tend to be very ideological, I must say. Often there's a script involved, there's a kind of doctrine that's being transmitted. And I'm not saying that I'm free of any of that, by no means. There is certainly, and maybe you'll figure it out quickly. But to at least be aware of the dangers of teleology. So of history written from the point of view of the present, in an overdetermined fashion, so that all roads lead to where you think you are now. So that's why I wouldn't exactly say, or I would condition the idea of the genealogy of the digital, a genealogy of the present, whatever that is, which certainly would take into account and involve and maybe even rotate around or the kind of things we're dealing with in the show. Anyway, in doing so, the goal is also to aid students, and I think many survey courses, this is a critique of the survey course as a form, by the way. Many survey courses don't do this. I don't know if this does, but it's an attempt. To aid students in developing an historical consciousness. So not just giving historical information, but to think about their presence and their relationship to history. That attends to both change and continuity. So things change and things repeat. Difference and repetition, to speak a different language. In place of rather more ideological, or at least more conventional, from to stories, from this to that, from mechanical to digital, or the rote periodization that is, I think, still quite dominant in many survey lectures. Anyway, and then secondly, the second aim is to extend contemporary approaches in media history, most of which actually have been operative outside architectural history, to which many archaeologies of media are traceable, to extend these beyond their conventional Euro-American frame. To me, this is very important. It's coming from a very different direction. It actually does have to do with digitalization, but in a very different way. Basically, to help the process of globalizing the curriculum, but through a channel that's different than the usual one of like sort of adding, classes on non-Western architecture and whatever to the curriculum. So in that sense, to help displace, or at least again, reframe the deeply entrenched Eurocentrism that still defines the MR curriculum in Columbia, and I suspect most everywhere else, despite valiant efforts to the contrary, and contribute to a critically worldly globalization of both disciplinary and extradisciplinary knowledge and imagination. So for sure, at this level, as you'll see, this project remains incomplete. So anyway, there's in both of these, there's an emphasis on both continuity and change. Conventional genealogies, especially ahistorical histories of the so-called discipline, often resemble family trees. In a sense, the terms are connected. From to roots to branches, descent from origins. This is not that, or at least it's not intended as that. Nietzsche, and after him Foucault, among many others, including the historian of science Thomas Kuhn, began the process of interrupting such narratives by cutting them with relatively sudden epistemic breaks or paradigm shifts or other eruptions and discontinuities. My own approach to the survey course and to history in general is really still within this Nietzschean tradition, but as I hope you'll see, in place of smooth continuities, dialectical cycles, or abrupt across-the-board breaks or paradigm shift, I try to trace for the students and sketch out clusters and patterns, emergent and divergent tendencies. You can think of this as a somewhat more Deleuzian, if you like, anti-familial, anti-Oedipal version of architecture's always mixed genealogy, more a periodically sprouting wild rhizome than a carefully pruned family tree. So, anyway, that I won't make you read all of this, but I'm going to show you the syllabus only to show you how difficult it is. This is really hard. For those of you who I speak to Antoine, among others, doing the survey course is always so dependent on what's in print, including now I'm happy to say I can use Antoine's book. But what is in print is quite limited around this. It's amazing, and actually the CCA, I must say, has led the way in this from the very, very beginning, because I'll show you here, this thing point. Where is it? Yeah, see here, the first reading on the thing is Robin Evans' piece on architecture protection from the Architecture and its Image catalog. You see that 1989 from this very institution. So this is in some sense an effort to both plug into that, but also to bring that kind of discussion to the foreground, to the forefront of architectural history teaching, to teach through the drawings, to basically to recognize that architects don't build things, they draw things, they issue instructions. Robin Evans was found as saying things like that. So, and to take that literally and say, okay, to all those students sitting in the room who have to listen to me whether they like it or not, what you're doing is making visualizations. We're going to talk about that in a historical way. Anyway, so there's basically, okay, that we had to minimize the reading, it's painful. I can't tell you how difficult this is to me, at least, and because I always want them to read more, and of course they have work to do. Anyway, I'm just showing you, okay, whatever. So what I'm going to do to bore you to tears is to just give you very, very short kind of digests of each week. So at least I hope you get a feel for the structure of this thing and its basic argument, which, as I said, I'm attempting to sort of move into this arena in a quasi-pedagogical way. So, things you might have read. What's very, very interesting, and I think it's worth thinking about in the publications that you guys are doing, and I'm of course happy to say now I can use the catalog for this show now in the syllabus. is actually that there's very little literature on architectural so-called representation at all after the Renaissance. It's really extraordinary. Some of the new, I mean, you know, now Barry's show on La Brousse, Barry Bergel's show on La Brousse, there's some new materials on the Beaux-Arts. Even, you know, the classic stuff on the Beaux-Arts, there's not a whole lot. And it's downhill from there. There's quite a lot on perspective. But, you know, there's Yvan Amboise' piece on axonometry. There's a few other things that I put in the, but, you know, relatively speaking, given the amount of weight that this subject has been given in our field, you know, through time, it's actually, I found it quite difficult and in an interesting way so basically this is a collage, this syllabus. It's not like, you know, Ken Frampton's book, chapter 1, chapter 2, you know, you can assign one text and this is it really is a montage of different types of text, different types of material. I found, for example, I think this is a totally underappreciated book, Hyun-Min Pei's book, The Portfolio and the Diagram, which is a beautiful account of the transition from the Beaux-Arts to the modern in the United States, on MIT Press from 2002. I find it, so there, I think, you know, it's been actually quite interesting and fun to sort of find and to either work with or discover hidden treasures in this process, but not easy, I must say. You know, you get into Frank Lloyd Wright, for example. This is in the section on the plan. There's very little actually, certainly very little critical writing on Frank Lloyd Wright's drawings, etc., etc. So, but there are beautiful things like Peter Collins' little piece on the origins of graph paper and its influence on architectural design. Total technical determinism. Very, very interesting. Okay, here's my friend Kepesh. There's Antoine. And we had to break this down for like, you know, what people had to read and what they should read. But, you know, so this Gombrich piece, I don't know that this is a standard in many architectural courses, and maybe it shouldn't be. But every time somebody utters the word map, I have the feeling that they actually should take a look at this at least. Anyway, here we go. Okay, so that's there it is. We'll get the gist of it. And of course you have to write papers. This is painful. Actually, how to assess, this was a really, really interesting problem. How to assess this, because honestly, I did not want the kind of yet another paper, you know, on whatever's been written before, because so little has been written before. So we and also it's a bit like we were talking about this through the video. These are design students, and, you know, for a required MR course, and this course is intended to bridge between the design curriculum, the history theory. It's officially a history theory course, at least my part of it is, and also the technical courses, what they're doing in the technology classes, in the professional courses, and you know, in none of those are they writing papers except for the other history theory courses. So the problem, I have to say, I should have said earlier, Pete Minoche is a veteran of this. He was a TA, kind of crucial TA in this, and an interlocutor, an advisor to me as we did this past semester. And he and his colleagues had to deal with this because they were grading these things. We came up with a truly imperfect project of making them do exams, which was really almost as painful as the papers, but maybe not quite as painful. So we haven't even yet, at least to my satisfaction, found the right medium for evaluating this kind of discussion. And it's not like just writing a paper to regurgitate the lecture or the reading or whatever. So, but we did want to try to find ways for them to translate their knowledge and their experiences from, and at least their intuitions from these other environments, from studio, from the tech courses, from visual studies, into a history theory discussion. So if you have any suggestions, I'm more than open to them. I think Pete probably is too. Anyway, okay, so I told the students that really, in order to understand what this course is about, you only need 2 images. The first one is this one. This is Albrecht Dürer's second perspective apparatus from the Painter's Manual 1525. This is a canonical image that's used very frequently in discussion, in the historical accounts of development and perspective. But what's important, I think, here is to understand that, and this is an argument that Friedrich Kittler actually makes about this, that I asked the students to read, the input-output process that's involved in making a perspective with this device. First of all, you have an apparatus, properly speaking. You don't have a machine. It's an apparatus which involves humans, subjects and objects, frames, information, etc. This is, of course, not a digital apparatus by any means. It's analog, and yet there are elements, there are aspects of this that we recognize when we think about how computers make things visual. And amongst which is the plotting of points, which, again, I think you can see Frank Gehry doing with his models over there. So this is a lute, and it's important that it's a lute because it's curved, and that's hard to do. I mean, you can't just make a geometrical perspective with it. So this apparatus becomes even more useful for this. So in here you have an assistant. Here you have the artist himself. You have the other sort of subordinate. There's always a master-slave relationship with technology, and this is no exception. Subordinate, whose job it is to move this stylus around the curved edges of the lute. And then here, very importantly, you don't see as well in this drawing, but it's well described. There's an XYZ system. There's a grid. And that grid, there are crosshairs, and those are moved around as the points are recorded. This is the line that marks the points, eventually to mark out the contour of the object. So it's an information system of a different sort. Many things are involved. There's labor involved. There are material things involved, but there's also a problem involved. There's the problem of how to describe a relatively complexly curved object in 2 dimensions. Here's the second sort of meta diagram for the course, which could be also used to describe the thing I just showed you. This is Shannon and Weaver's, or it's usually attributed to Shannon, a basic diagram of an information circuit from a mathematical view of communication, 1949. So here you have in effect all the same elements, but described in a different manner. You have a transmitter or a source, information source, a medium of transmission, a channel through which the signal moves, a noise source, interference, or resolution problem. Like the problem of resolution you would have because you can't plot every point in a sort of continuous function on that perspective apparatus. And you have then the distorted signal that comes out, a receiver, and a destination. And then, of course, you have the potential for feedback through the system. And then I explained to students in that Dürer then the transmitter is the lute, and operator number 1, the channel is the string, window, grid, pencil, paper, the material conditions of production, the noise source is the humans. It's all of that. All of that is a source of error, of noise, of irresolution. And the receiver is operator number 2 with the panel and the paper and the eventual drawing. And likewise, you get feedback loops. So the hypothesis and the premise for the students is that even though this is over 50 years old now, whatever it is over 60 years old, is still a plausible point of departure. To think, and certainly better for us than the things that we have already, in which the kind of epistemological apparatus we have already that says there was perspective, and then there was, for example, axonometry, and then there was something else. Because as you might have intuited from my insinuation with the Dürer drawing, or etching, the perspective is back. And so a linear story that goes from perspective to something else is not enough, because until relatively recently it's been very difficult not to draw perspective in many of the softwares that are out there. So So we need other interpretive grids. We need other, and also we need ways of accounting for the historical, as it were, facts of the persistence of perspective in other forms and things like that. Right? The fact that Maya, in a sense, biases towards perspective, and etc. So, anyway, okay. So among those facts, and this takes us a little bit to the other goal, which is to globalize the imagination of the students, is to remind. To remind students and to remind ourselves, all of us, that among the things that drawings do is they travel, they move. It's one of the most important things that drawings do. They must have moved from all over the world to get into the room over there. A text that I use for this is a very well-known text by Bruno Latour called On the Immutable Mobiles, as he calls them. And as in every case, in all of these, I'm warning you 13 weeks, I'll do it as quickly as I can. I'll try to do about 15 minutes. The theorem, I'm just going to read off these theorems for you, and then maybe I'm just going to flick through a few mostly well-known illustrations. But the theorem in this case is that drawings travel. So each week there's a theorem, and then the lecture for that week attempts to elucidate that theorem and to explain it. So drawings travel. So that means drawings are in the world. They move. They're things in the world. They're interfaces with other things in the world. And so on. So and with them, for example, the classical orders and the endless repetitions of drawings of classical orders correspond to such travel. This is I show this because this is by William Ware, who was the founder of the School of Architecture at Columbia, and he was the first one in the school to teach a class like this. That was his job. If you've used Avery Library, you know the Ware collection in Avery Library, or Ware Lounge at Avery, that's William Ware. He wrote a book called Shades and Shadows, and the problem was how to shade the complex curvatures on a Tuscan capital in this case. It was the same problem actually that was discussed by Robin Evans in the CCA catalog essay that I mentioned, and it has returned in ray tracing and radiosity and so on and so forth. For our new shading apparatuses, how to describe geometrically accurate curved shadows, or to put it another way, how to describe the Tuscan sun. Week 2, delineation, parties, diagrams, travel sketches. Every drawing is also a drawing of another drawing. This reiterates and extends the theme of circulation. Drawings are never simply original. They repeat technique, referent. I use the Parthenon, for example. Le Corbusier is not just drawing the Parthenon, he's drawing somebody else's understanding of the Parthenon, and there's many historiographers of this. You could look at Bannister Fletcher and you'll see the same type of, the same type of thing being described in a different way. And by the way, the rule of the class is only that we show only drawings, no buildings. People are mad at me for that. My fundamentalist colleagues object. Architects design buildings. I say they do drawings. The Beaux-Arts tradition moves around the world through the 20th century. This is a very quick example from Liang Xisheng, and Lynn Huiyin. Liang Xisheng is the author of what was translated into English as a pictorial history of Chinese architecture, the first sort of canonical history. It basically invented for the English language the idea of Chinese architecture, which didn't exist discursively before that, and it did that through the techniques of the Beaux-Arts, such that he felt like he had to describe a Chinese order. There was no such thing. There is no such thing. This is totally composite. But he was trained at Penn in the type of drawings that I showed you just now, in drawing Tuscan sun, and so he translated the Tuscan into the Chinese. Okay, anyway, there's lots to say, but the idea that the problem itself is established by as it were, a way of seeing. Like that we must find a way to describe an order in the sense of the classical orders, because that's how we did it before. Is a kind of, of course it's a post-imperial enterprise and so on and so forth. Okay, the world picture numbers as standards, with the theorem here being to make a diagram is also to make a picture. This is counterintuitive, but by this I mean, I'm quoting literally Heidegger here, the famous piece on the world picture, which, as he says, when understood essentially does not mean a picture of the world, but the world conceived and grasped as a picture, from which we might be tempted to understand the world conceived and grasped as perspective, or as photography. However, what Heidegger actually is saying is closer to the idea of calculation, the world as calculable. That's what he means by picture, build. Calculable, enumerate. I love the French. I always love this thing at the CCA where you have to kind of almost sort of translate between. So the French is, the numérique is in a sense more precise to my mind than digital in the English connotation. Calculation, enumeration. In other words, what we can call, using more contemporary language, diagrammatic knowledge. So diagrams like this one, Lisitsky's. So it's not just the objects, but it's the subjects also, the humans who are being redrawn, described geometrically in this case, or Fuller and Bayer's World Energy Map, and Otto Norrath's Modern Man in the Making. So again, subjects and humans and things being shaped, being counted, shaped, reshaped, standardized, iterated, reiterated, etc. And then finally, human factors, Dreyfus. This is the Joe and Josephine standardized figures for ergonomics. So number, the human is defined as number, described as measure, as number, as a kind of primal calculus. Okay, week 4, object experience, axonometry versus, by the way, I mean, I should say that throughout this, how architects draw figures is parallel with, it's described with including, because we also know that this is, I think the students tend to relate to this too, like how to populate the drawing, or whether to populate the drawing is a question. And of course some of the techniques for populating the drawing that are used by the animation software is derived from some of these early models. Okay, so object and experience, axonometry versus photography. The theorem being the visual description of an object and the visual description of experience are both contingent and mutually exclusive. They're both historically constructed and incommensurable. This is a complicated, I'm not going to be able to summarize it all for you, but it's basically about the relationship between photography as it was used in the 20s and 30s and axonometry. The desire to see through photography to a kind of, in this case, Le Corbusier's photograph of the Parthenon in Rashid, to see through photography transparently into as he calls it, a plastic system, versus the description of that analytically from no point, either in isometric, ISO being the isometric describing the equal relationship between this particular form of projection and what's sometimes called trimetric or axonometric view. This is from a history of engineering. This is many of these techniques came from engineering first, and then they were borrowed or developed in architecture. And then the modernist confusion of the difference between isometric projection from planar surfaces that you get in a cube and in an XYZ coordinate system and perspectival. This is Lisitsky's diagram from K and Pangiometry, art in pangeometry. What he just was thinking, he thought about as a paradigm shift from basically Renaissance perspective to a kind of axonometric paradigm. Panofsky actually responds to this proposition in his famous perspective essay. He says it's all nonsense and whatever. But this is, in a nutshell, the reason for putting photography and axonometry together in this particular lecture, and then showing things like this, Gropius's Turton housing estate, drawn as a Lisitsky crown, in which even in this drawing you get a little bit of a subjective confusion, the inside-outside oscillation that you get in a crown painting. You can't quite tell. If you really, this could be an inside of the cube, it could be foreground, background, that kind of flipping happens. Anyway, there's much more to say there, as with this week. The other thing, by the way, I intend by this is to challenge the relatively stable narratives that have been disseminated, and especially at Columbia, are still disseminated about the logic of modern architecture. So rather than describing Gropius's thing about as meat prefabrication and mass production, which of course it is, to understand that there's also a way of knowing and a troubled way of knowing, a question that's visible in that drawing. How do we know this thing? That even as we describe it as objective and measurable and quantifiable, etc. Okay, dynamism, time and movement. The theorem being to describe visually a moving body, whether in our case a body moving through a building or a building moving, is really to ask, is it alive? This is in some ways an homage to my dear friend Detlef Mertens and his work on Mies and on modernism, on the kind of animate qualities in modernism, but also an engagement, kind of sort of this gathering of many of the dramas of dynamism and movement that run through the modernist canon, from Liszewski in this case. And again, I'm showing the figure as well as the building. From Liszewski to Boccioni to the Gilbreths and to this guy. Of course, again, suspended in XYZ coordinate system. And then Marais, the dissolution of the body into a system of vectors or lines. And then this is the Brunel, the body moving around and supposedly the distribution of the space optimally in relationship to those vectors. And then subsequently, the graphic designer and artist Herbert Matter doing a chronophotograph of a man getting dressed, supposedly. This is published by the Eameses in 49, and here by Moholy Nagy. Then Edgerton's, so this is like the kind of organization man, corporate guy getting dressed on the one hand and then going and playing golf, photographed by Harold Edgerton. Desmore Shoot bends the shaft. Stroboscopic photography, the capturing of motion, and then an incredible moment in which Harold Edgerton, the technologist in MIT who made Gideon loves those photographs and so on, he was asked to photograph the atomic test, but also he with his company designed the firing mechanism for this bomb. So the complete confusion between the record and the event. So this is the atomic bomb explosion of 1952 in Inuit Atoll. So the problem of, as it were, the distance between what is being represented and the act of representing it is collapsed in this particular moment. At the moment of atomic, the trigger, he designed the trigger for the moment. And he also designed the photograph. Okay, so machines and organisms, this is closer to Detlef's work, but I'm using it here in relationship to the Corbe's famous Algiers project, this sort of French rationality supposedly over here, and Algerian organicity, and the kind of Orientalism of the native in the curved forms. That story is repeated endlessly by my own colleagues still today, I have to say. You can hear the critique, right? This is a little bit of a curricular battle. To use Latour's terms, the question is, what are the interests that are drawn together? French imperialism, for example, and drawn apart by this particular model as it moves from Paris to Algiers. Likewise, in a different register, meets the skyscraper, the crystalline and the animate together, and then much later, the Henderson, Palazzi, Smithson, Bynum parallel of life and art at the ICA in '53, the use of scientific photography to describe growth, form, movement, and so on. And then, in a sense, the translation of that. This is a Smithson's project. This is the QA urban study and map building project, so you get this kind of organism working its way down the highway. And then you get the architects presenting that organism in the model that moves. I don't know. And again, we await, at least I await the scholarship on this so that we can actually fill in the gaps of the information. Where the model was built and how it was transported and so on. And then, of course, you see the patterns, the organic patterns on the wall, the extraordinary encounter that I think that you see here. Week 6, this is the canonical week, plan as generator, in which the theorem is very simple, plan as symbolic form. Argument being that perspective as symbolic form is displaced at the very moment that Panofsky writes his essay by the plan, but more specifically by the horizon. The vanishing point displaces into the horizon becomes the structuring element rather than the vanishing point, and the argument, and we see this, here's Korb's analysis, we see this in projects like this, that through the planimetric development, this is his mother's house on the lake, not only extrapolate the horizon into the building and vice versa, you know Reichland's argument about the Fenêtre here in this house, but also the territory, the extensiveness, the extension of space, which we also find, I think, in Mies in a somewhat different way, and particularly, in the kind of boundlessness, the kind of reaching of the lines towards the edges of the paper, and much more explicitly in Wright in the problem of the horizon, aka the frontier, aka the conquest of that frontier in the American imagination, in the Great Plains, and in the houses. And then he's working in a very similar context in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. At the same moment, this is the Jacobs house in Madison. This is Mies's house. Again, on the horizon, the frontier, the edge, the boundary, the mountains, the landscape, etc. Okay, again, I'm going way too quickly. Week 7, grids, the first order of abstraction. The theorem being abstraction at a certain moment, at this moment, more or less early to mid-century, involves the interplay of figures and grids. In other words, that the problem is not the opposition, as Rosalind Krauss argues, of the figure to the grid. It's that these things coexist continually, and paradigmatically, I use these images. That was the self-portrait, the figure of the letters in Bauhaus typography, extracted out of the grid, and then the various figures posing before grids, and eventually, famously for Team 10, the Smithson's the kind of insertion of the human back into the grid as a critique of this kind of a thing, and that kind of a thing, the grid itself as all there is. So, the way it's usually put, like, Team 10 humanizes modernist abstraction. The argument here is that actually the grid is a problem of figuration, not its alternative. Again, it's maybe the one. You can imagine, remember the Gilbreth figure, I thought I had it here. It's the guy standing in the XYZ coordinate system. That's who the modern human is. The modern human is a figure in a grid. Okay, pattern seeing. Theorem, this circa 1960, nature, including humans, dissolves into patterns. Here again, the question is, what are you looking at? Are you looking at, this is from Kepes, Language of Vision, 1944, an eye or a series of dots, a pattern of dots. Here, an earlier experiment with computing. This is from Kepes' Modular Proportion Symmetry Rhythm, 66. This is that series of books he did with scientists and artists and so on to explore the boundaries between art and science. This is a diagram of the output of a cellular automaton, a growth pattern from Ulam, Stanislav Ulam. The text is called The Patterns of Growth in Figures, Mathematical Aspects. So you start here in this kind of algorithm that grows the system out into this pattern. That's in Kepes. And then, of course, patterns like this one, the punch card. This is supposedly one's whole life. One's biography, and then the differentiation of different types of networks, again, relatively canonical images. Paul Baron from the Rand Corporation, 64, centralized, decentralized, and distributed. Negroponte's architecture machine, scanning the map of Boston. The question is, how do we read a map, right? Can a robot be taught to read a map? Alexander, the determination of components for an Indian village. Again, Orientalism. There is never not a world. You see, the point is there's never not a world in visualization. And the relation, like in this case, Alexander's patronizing Orientalist relationship to the so-called non-West is figured in this drawing. And it's figured in the idea of the pattern. It's figured in the desire of Silicon Valley later to, the people at Sun Microsystems in the 1990s, to, in a sense, learn from Christopher Alexander. And it is, again, a much longer discussion, but why an Indian village? That's the only question I asked you. And then, of course, the Team 10 efforts to produce villages with patterns here in the Free University. Free meaning West German democratic, not East German socialist. And therefore organic, like an Indian village, or an Arab or a Mediterranean village. Okay, from above or below, is now the critique of modernism from below. In mid-century, again the theorem, in mid-century Europe and the United States, it's largely restricted to these countries. The critique of top-down visuality, i.e. the master plan, substitutes the view from the street. So there's a response to the top-down master planning of modernism. The view from the street, as you saw in the Team 10 grid, is substituted for the aerial view. Even as a simultaneous shift in sovereignty, a little tricky here, from top-down power to bottom-up control, this is Deleuze's argument about the control society, tends to nullify this critique. So this is actually, okay, so basically in a nutshell, it's this. People like the situationists respond, so they describe Paris like this, Guy Debord's. But the problem is that Deleuze helps us understand that the street is already becoming a control system. It's not just that power works from the top down, Haussmann, tear it all down. Already around the 1950s, the channels of power are becoming capillary, and they're entering the body. They're operating on the street. Nevertheless, the critique remains, visible and valid. And here you have the socialist version. This is Stefan Beers and Guibon's Siepes, Cybersyn Control Room from Santiago. This is for Allende, maybe I had the pleasure of listening to Bonsepe describe this in a colloquium at the Bauhaus once. It was fantastic. Incredible thing, this cyber kind of command center, Star Trek, Saarinen style, whatever, interface. So that's the top-down command economy. Here is an encounter between the two. This is from Guido Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers. Algiers recurs. Algiers is a recurring trope in modernist discourse. It occurred. This is a scene in which you have the French general telling me how they're going to deal with the Kasbah. Of course, the same Kasbah that was romanticized by Team 10, as we just saw in the Berlin Free University. So this is how we're going to deal with the Kasbah, and this is how the Israeli Defense Force deals with Nablus. This is from the Eisman's work, again, rhizomatically reading Deleuze, and then breaking through the walls rather than bombing them from the top. Okay, week 10, we're headed towards the finish line. The International Division of Labor, risk. This is about working drawings, really, and it's really an allegory. I mean, one could have done this at any moment along the spectrum, along the chronology, but the theorem being that drawings distribute risk economically, technologically, and psychically. For example, there's a patent application in the room over there. There are lots of, sort of in the drawings that are on the walls here, there is a distribution of risk. There are legal claims being made as to who's responsible for what, as German manufacturers encounter Japanese architects and collaborate on complicated joints. That drawings materialize this, but they also, and they describe it, they adjudicate these relationships, but they also distribute that, literally in that sense that I was describing earlier of around the world at this point by the 1970s or 80s. Among the citations and readings here is Ulrich Risk Society, in which risk is an environmental category. It's a category of the environment. There are many other things we could say about it, but I just want to, the example that I use, okay, so Fuller, this is a risk management project because, risks are different inside the dome than outside the dome. This is basically a ghettoization of Midtown. And this is a more literal, the world game distribution, a game played with risk. Playing out the possible scenarios for resources, for the use of resources around the world. And here, interestingly, the back and forth between Utzon, this is very nicely described by Andrew Saint in his book Architect and Engineer, back and forth between Utzon and Arup. Arup figure very largely here in these stories, and again, the work remains to be done more systematically. But in the calculation and derivation of the roof shelf, this is Arup's, this is the response from within Utzon's office to the propositions made by the Arab engineers, the transformation of a ribbed dome proposal into a geometry of partial spheres, this model in the office, that was then described, basically parametrically and in a measurable way under the direction of Peter Rice by Arab. So the back and forth, again, very analogous to some of the relationships that are visible here on the wall. The one I try to concentrate on more here is the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. It's a very interesting project. It's pretty well documented, but still, crave more material. The problem of the client, the bank, but who is the bank? The bank is a board of directors. Where is that board of directors? They sit around a table. What do they need? They need slides. They need folios. They don't, maybe they get models later, but not right away. Those kinds of things. It so happens that okay, so this is Foster's presentation. So there are some sketches that precede this that have been published. This is the sort of more formal kind of, architect making notes presentation for the proposal, the RFP to get the project of the original idea. And this is a consultant in St. Louis working with Foster later on the development of a wall. In a sense, this is an early iteration of the Bob Hudgens function, the curtain wall consultant kind of function, and the exchange of drawings that are involved. This is the Picon team. This is, the Picon team, the office landscape or Landschaft crowd. Here they are working with Foster, doing a survey, with the client survey, create a user survey, kind of vote on what they want, and then this would become a database, and that would inform the components that are used in the office interiors. This is it's also a form of value engineering, sort of prioritizing this and that. And then Foster's the function of visual materials to persuade. This is the slide. These are the slides that he presented to the client around the table, to the board of directors of the bank, in making the case for the project. A series of sober axonometrics. Sober rationality in the name of a kind of corporate representation of the project. In the bank itself. This is a photo montage. So the project itself as a multimedia exchange that eventually, as I think is actually figured in the building, is synthesizable. It's a kind of synthesis, a total media synthesis in this kind of super studio-like environment in which at least notionally all the consultants and all the interests and all the surveys and all the documents are there, and the drawing made, in effect, to describe that. Okay, postmodernism, or in other words, black and white and color, form, figure, context, theorem being for what has been called postmodernism, drawing is a form of binary thinking. So it's a way of gathering together a heterogeneous set of documents associated with so-called postmodernism, and say what they have in common is not stylistic, it's not James's pluralism, it's actually a kind of binarism. Things like figure ground, traditional modern, monumental vernacular, architecture world, self-other, etc., etc. And postmodernism then understood as a breakdown of that circuit that I showed, a communications breakdown, and a desperate overcompensation for the noise in the system. A crisis of meaning, where the question is not, as is usually said, what does it mean? What does that Aldo Rossi drawing mean? But the real question is, does it mean? Can it mean? How can it mean? So, is it? Can I communicate? Does this artifact operate within a communicative circuit any longer? Right? That's the real postmodernist question. To understand that, you have to, I think, in a sense, look a little bit away from the picture and look at the pattern of pictures. Look at the repetitions and the patterns that we get things like this, the kind of endless appearances of figuring ground. Here's the Roma Interrata, and then the desire to produce, to draw out of that figure-ground relation meaningful artifacts like Creer's sort of public room, and then to construct ideological statements around them that are built around Creer's idea of, I still very strongly am convinced, Europe for the Europeans. In other words, a Europe made of, in a sense, made by medieval artisans, not North African immigrants, which is of course what Europe was, and Luxembourg was becoming, because this is a competition project for the capital of the European Union in the mid-1970s. And Graves's efforts to play one figure against another in these studies for the Portland building. If any of you don't know what the Portland building is, if you watch Portlandia, you will have seen, oops, how did I do that? Just as I was going to show you Portlandia. Where'd it go? Oh, there it is. You will have seen this in the opening sequence of Portlandia. That is Portlandia, that's Portland. Allegorical figure superimposed on other basically empty signs. Again, the question is not what does this building mean, does it mean? That's the desperate question. Can it mean? How possibly can this mean? That question is played out, I'm suggesting, through the visual but also spatial formal problem of figuring ground. But not only high postmodernism in the American sense, but also other traditions like that, like Kahn's exoticism, is desire to extract a kind of primal sort of figuration out of ancient ruins, and an analogous effort on the part of an architect like Charles Correa. And this is a corporate building that is drawn in the manner of Kahn's kind of metaphysical sketches, and it's basically a Kevin Roche building rendered in sandstone, local stone. It's a bank. It's a government bank. But you see again the desperate desire to make the figure speak. It doesn't matter what language it speaks or whether it's stone or whatever. Okay, and then the other kind of in the world of Mimar and the languages, the visual practices associated with that, Mimar and critical regionalism and those kinds of postmodernisms, the Autocon program, the Autocon Awards. The peasant house, the figure of the peasant, of course, drawn here in architectural form in Hassan Fathi's. This is a project for relocating people. This is what this is. This is a kind of urban cleansing project where there was this village that grew up around the monuments. Fathi, as a high bourgeois architect, was asked to remove the peasants. And that he did by designing another village famously known as New Gornis, in this language of the so-called vernacular and so on and so forth. The argument here being, again, that the need, and you can look through Fathi's drawings, the need to do, the way of describing the vernacular as a kind of, let's say, archaeological reality corresponds with and translates into other worldly forms and practices that are not as sort of benign as alternatives to high modernist abstraction or whatever as they typically are. And you can see that in drawings. You can also see it in here in Klaus Herdeg's use of Colin Rowe's figure ground technique to describe the Mughal monument of Fatehpur Sikri. This is this is near the Taj Mahal in India. Again, the desire to make forms travel, and vice versa, or not vice versa, but kind of analogous with that or alongside that. I can't resist this one because the other thing that drawings were doing in those days were telling stories, and Ungers invites you, of course, to ask whether there's a story really here at all. If at all, what is it about? It's a kind of empty promenade. And he even plays that game in a self-portrait. So it goes outward and it goes inward, and in which the architect himself is represented as a kind of cipher. Okay, and here we go. Now we arrive at a digital, but not the digital in quite the way that we're at yet here. But finally, but in the form of, okay, the theorem here, first, is simply that computers compute. That's it. That's all you need to know. And you know, that's what's happening when we look at things like that. The images here are mostly from AutoCAD manual. This is actually from the trade fair, this trade show exhibit in which AutoCAD, well, this isn't the one where it was premiered. It was premiered in 1982, but this is a picture that happened to be available in 84 in Vegas. So just to remind you that when we speak about these softwares, we're speaking about products, we're speaking about scenes, sort of exchanges, encounters, interfaces, like this one. We're speaking about investment in the product. They're very proud about their success, so they have actually their whole IPO online, you can look at it. And then we're also talking about interfaces, about, in this case, a microcomputer CAD system from 1986. This is from around the same period as most of the work now. This is from another CAD manual. You see the relationship. You have to have this particular software to do this particular thing. They're advertising software. But this is a now long gone device, that this sort of light pen tablet thing. And of course, there is a the gender politics of the interface, again, are not transparent. These are cliches. The cliches of the woman as assistant working for IBM. You know, I can show you photos from the 50s that we produced. But there's this, the discursivity of this also moves and operates in that direction, and must be you know, articulate. Here's the code itself. Just very simple instructions from inside AutoCAD 1985, how to set up an O-snap, object snap. So the point being here is in computing, what computers do is actually, they issue commands or they respond to commands. So that's I think is a very important thing that architects have now learned to do, is to issue commands. And that's what you do when you input in something into one of these. And then you also, you know, in the AutoCAD world, in the old days and still today, this persists. There are certain standards, so the old graphic standards becomes snappable and you know, sort of pickable objects on a tablet. So there are inventories, there's data sets, all of this is part of the world. And again, to go along with the issuing of commands, is input, output, input, output, input, output, input, output, endlessly ad infinitum. That's what we're talking about. And that kind of ... the ellipsis at the end of the input-output process, I think, along with the grids and along with the perspective, the crisis of the subject that's associated with perspective, you know, reproduces the in a sense, anxiety about where the beginning and the end of all of this is. Where do I belong in all of this? Where is my object? Where is the world? Where do we stop? How do you know? And so on and so forth. Okay, and then of course, those days they were not able to, I'm just showing you this to remind you that perspective just keeps repeating itself in different forms. They couldn't keep the lines out. And then eventually this is there's a very nice piece by Kittler on the difference between ray tracing and radiosity, which brings you back to the problem of rays versus luminous surfaces that we see in the Tuscan capital, and the shading problem of the 19th century Beaux-Arts. Here, this is an example of an early shading exercise probably using radiosity. Sorry, most likely ray traced. With kind of fake radiosity highlights, the white stuff, surface effects simulated. Okay, fine. Then last one, parameters. The theorem being, you know, maybe this is a way of having a discussion also, because it's the most open-ended ... part, that what we call parametrics today constitutes a second order of abstraction, of bracketing out. See, you know, in other words, that the first move, the first action is to make a parenthesis and say the variables will move within this parenthesis. So there's an inside world and an outside world, a bracket constructed, or dividing the world into things that can be seen and hence counted as maxima and minima, as variable parameters, and things that cannot, or for by design or by accident or necessity or whatever, excluded from from the scene. This harks back to some of the techniques of risk management and thinking in those terms generally. But the so here we have, to bring us back to the CCA, Greg's project from about the house, in which the parametric variables are run out for you across the scene, but nevertheless there are certain constants. So that's the interesting thing, is what remains constant, what's allowed to change, and then at the in effect other end of the spectrum, sort of the AutoCAD, and the so-called analytical dashboards that are now being implemented in corporate offices, in which maxima and minima are articulated and modeled and modulated, again within very, very strict, or with a different set of constraints. The point being about parametrics, and I say this really as a proposition, not something, not a conclusion, is that what I think we could begin to think together about is what it means to identify this or that as a parameter, and then modulate it, play with it, make it do certain things, that act, that sort of first move, this is a parameter, and then at the exclusion of something else, or et cetera, and then subject it to these regimes of counting, enumeration, measurement, and variability that are mapped out here in technocratic form. So I think that maybe is more than enough.
Do they really read all the stuff?
Sorry? No, that's the problem.
You're reassuring me.
No, the first problem basically is to, because, okay, I mean, this is shop talk in a way, but
yeah, I know.
but you have, they're reading, canonical histories of modernism in the, up-to-date ones in many cases, but that don't focus on this kind of stuff, but just tell the stories of modernism, and we don't really still require, we're trying to require post-war. It's a long story, and reading for that in their history theory, the official lecture courses. So this is within the visual studies curriculum, so it's even, the expectations are even lower, in terms of both the students and by extension the curriculum. I show you that because I'm basically saying you guys should at least know that you could be reading this one day if you are interested in this. And know that if you did read this, some of what I'm saying may make more sense than it does now, or you may, have the wherewithal to challenge what I'm saying. That's the point. And of course, as you know, you get always a minority, but an important minority, some of them are represented in the room here, who take you up on that, and they actually do read it, and then they come and ask questions. The best part is this part, the Q&A part, in which it's always the same ones that raise their hands, like, Robin Evans said this, what about that,
Another question, which is, do you really need a single chronological order?
Well,
I mean, in some ways, one could argue that you have abstraction from the start,
sure.
And that actually, you're pretending it's a kind of chronology, which would lead me to another question related to this one. What if by the end the computer was not where you found pretty much the whole story?
Oh, yeah, I know.
Instead of only the abstraction.
Right. Well, I mean, the curricular pretension of this is that it tells you, it gives you another way into the 20th century, so the chronology, theoretically, but that's just an excuse. The real answer to your question is actually that things do change, and they do change, I think, over time, and it's not the same. Even though there are grids now, and there were grids then, they're not the same grids, they don't function the same way, and part of the challenge, and as I said, this is an incomplete and kind of work in progress, is explaining how and why things change. And I think this is absolutely critical. I mean, for example, even just the subject matter, like, okay, Le Corbusier in Algiers, in the 1930s, is one thing, and the use of the models and the drawings and his diagram. I don't have time ever to show all of this, but it's in the readings. He shows the north-south, greater Paris, greater France, kind of the imaginary of French imperialism inscribed into the project. That, by the time you get to the Algerian War of Independence in the 1960s, is a different story since when I show the Battle of Algiers. And then by the time you get to the students' imagination, and sadly we at Columbia, I don't know about Harvard if you get a lot of North African students, but we get students from every other continent except generally Africa, although occasionally there'll be some. So there'll be somebody informed in those histories. They don't know it. They don't know that this meant something. It's not just a model, not just a curvy line and a straight line, right? So this is what I mean about trying to use the material to develop a historical consciousness. So that has changed. So it's important. So the chronology is important in that sense. The world of Team 10 is not the same. Is not the world of Le Corbusier in that regard, and you can see. So maybe it could be my own sort of dialogue with myself about this is whether one is asking this to do too much. In a sense, you're asking these poor little drawings to do the work of, in effect, an entire curriculum. By introducing the kind of them to the sort of technical problems of representation, to the cultural dramas around those problems, to the projects themselves, to the context of those projects, to the encounters that are involved. But I always will you aim high and hope for the best. Yeah.
One thing the chronology does is I got a little bit of a whiplash when you went from a modernist visualization paradigm to then postmodernism.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I whipped back right into modernism again with the computer.
Right.
And I just wonder, did the computer have to get postmodern to get accepted?
Well,
because I think that stuff looks like more like the Rossi collage.
Sure. Well, some of it. But yes, of course, I do show a lot of, work. I mean, I put your project in full circle with CCA as well. But I've shown Gary's work, other things and I talk about that. But yes, because as I said before about the crown, I'm sort of answering a yes and no to Antoine's because I'm insisting that if there is a chronology here, it is, to quote De Boer, not necessarily in that order. Like in other words, not De Boer, Godard. In other words, beginning, middle, and end are not necessarily in that order. And when I'm saying in shorthand, in code, Nietzschean, Foucauldian, Deleuzian, this is what I mean. Repetition, recurrence, as well as development, iteration, sort of growth and change. But to show the AutoCAD version of it does make the drawings that look very modernist, everything, either that or cheesy vernacular developer, professional, commercial, right? However, when you link that up with a discourse on risk and on the transformation of the relations of production that really correspond to what we call postmodernity, then it's good. I'm glad you kind of maybe hesitated there because that's part of the point. The point is to in a sense remix our sense of sequence. By reminding us, first of all, that the grid is always there, but also that when you understand a drawing, even a drawing that looks like even a Rossi drawing, let's say an analog Rossi hand drawing, as participating ultimately, eventually, in that same set of relations that Norman Foster's work does, from the same moment, the same. It's not just a sort of throwback to an earlier moment in which you colored things in with watercolor. I could cite Stephen Hole's work today for that matter. To understand these are all participating in this in a sense regime of the distribution of information and thereby risk. then what we mean by postmodernism and the kind of stylistic descriptions that we tend to use recedes a little bit. It doesn't completely go away, but it's maybe put in some perspective, so to speak, vis-a-vis the ways of abstracting out of those figures other values.
Really don't use that old Michel.
It's too much for them, I mean.
Structure of time.
Yeah, I know. I do.
Of Michel.
Of course, I mean, I'm happy to salute Michel Serre, but I actually avoid the theory in for the most part in the
You seem to have a temporal structure which have wormholes and
yeah, sure. I said that, yeah. I mean, I could say Serre, I said Deleuze, but it could. Yes, but I deliberately for the students I don't do say okay, you must read this and this to understand the model of history that I'm using, because that would you never get to the history. And I'm just basically it's a kind of theory practice problem. Like this is the practice. This is like an attempt at least to put that kind of epistemic model or mode into practice, and not just that one, but one that's certainly sympathetic with that. But at the same time, very interestingly, I think, this is also a history. You can see it's a history of capitalism, for example. This is the kind of thing that Serre shies away from. I mean, the movement from Taylorism to computation and especially to risk management is a change. I mean, Marxists will describe this, moving in a more Hegelian way, as a phase change in the movement of capital around the world. So, what Foster did and continues to do with Arup and everybody else was not the same. You can't drill a wormhole back to Le Corbusier and his consultants in Algiers or anywhere else. So there's a kind of deliberate tension between accounts, as I said, of historical change and development, positive and negative, and and I do challenge the students to think about the political implications of what they're looking at, and the often somewhat more difficult to follow Baroque ins and outs, in which I have to say I do take pleasure, as you can see.
It also seems like you're heading towards saying some things about high fidelity, BIM modeling, big data, things like that. How does that factor in, do you think?
Yeah, I would say, I'm not sure what I would conclude about that right now. On the one hand, I align it most closely to the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank kind of scenario. In other words, it's on the side of Foster, but it's also, and it runs through Fuller and Otto Neurath, and it can be used in all kinds of ways, etc. And it's very big in Columbia. There are all kinds of. There's a CBIT, they call it. It's a studio that's required. No, it's not required. You know this. So I have to talk to everybody else. The second semester, the second year of the core, the 3-year core, it kind of fades into the advanced studios. And the second semester of second year, sort of half in, half out. You may remember this. So this CBIT thing is now. This is where they do BIM. They basically do a whole. It's like an office simulated kind of office. And they do a kind of BIM-like world. David Benjamin, maybe some of you know David, and Scott Marble and others, kind of do this. Laura sometimes teaches them that. Anyway, so it's in their curriculum, and it's not the only thing, but then sometimes some others are doing some other things. But I feel, that one must address this, because I know it's coming on the curricular horizon. It's basically an update of what someone was doing with their version of AutoCAD in the 80s, an attempt to synthesize, at least in the big practices like KPF, which is what I think, synthesize and all the inputs in a kind of total system. how that interacts with formal experiments, more esoteric studies, so on and so forth, I think remains an open question. This is why I think I at least would like to pose the question. The question is, the question of parametrics, I think is the question of what's in and what's out. That's how I see the problem of parametrics. It's not so much, what happens, of course, it's interesting. I don't mean to diminish the interest of what's in, the difference between playing with, light and shadow as a variable within, what you can do there in massing the building in a BIM model versus, the modulation of the surface and something like that. However, the act of thinking, there are quanta that are measurable and manageable that belong in this bracket. And by extension, there are quanta that are going to be excluded from that bracket, or is, I think, the most fundamental thing, and that's shared. That's what's shared. So this is what I'm saying. If you want, my ideal version of this class, which is not an architectural history survey class, it's a kind of thought experiment, is an anonymous history. It's a history without authorship. Because I think that's actually the problem that's on the table that computation puts on the table. Actual, serious historiographical thinking that wants to take computers head on has to think the possible absence of both the historian as a figure and a narrator in that sense, and the possible absence of author figures, the author function. This is, in a sense, yes, I know. He's shaking.
I remember Chartier telling us about the end of authorship.
I know. I understand that. It's a long story. We were talking a bit over there, but as I said, that I do think it's important. But I said this is a thought experiment. This Kittler's version is very strong in this direction, yes, it's a phantom, but it's a let's say if you want, it's a horizon. It's a dimension. It has to be on the table. That question has to be on the table in other words, the possibility of a history only of systems.
What I'm thinking is the BIM model, in a modern way, wants to be exact and encyclopedically document every, like you said, whereas the big data issue of a Google search engine couldn't be more different than that. It actually doesn't care about exactly. It cares about getting the group right.
Yes, and the patterns, but it wants to see the patterns.
Right.
It's a pattern recognition machine.
But the precision.
That's a good point.
It's kind of out the window.
Right, that's
it's
true.
an interesting idea.
The resolution, you mean? Yeah. That's a good point.
Now, you mentioned this idea of a computer history or author. I wanted to ask you, in the selection of images, it's many drawings or products of the actual drawing, and then all of a sudden you have the computer. And you do not have any pencil, any drafting table, any compass so much, and there is...
sorry.
So my question is about this sort of animistic belief that we still are involved in the computer as an animated personality in the narrative.
No, actually, every single one of those, I went so quickly, maybe I didn't, properly explain, but every single one of those, I intend, when I try to teach this, I try to explain to people the medium in which it's made. This is not about, there is a random set of images and then now we have computers. That's exactly not what this is about. This is about the difference between a gouache painting by Elizitsky, a technically drawn with using, and in fact, there's some interesting ways of thinking about axonometry that have to do with the presence of 30-60 triangles and T-squares that actually historians of engineering try to explain it this way. That's a bit deterministic, but and the various other media. So the medium is not exactly the message here, not with computing either in the, triumphal, religious, McLuhanesque sense. The kind of metaphysical, I think that's what you're alluding to. But for sure, the aim is to make the media speak, and specifically as this or that type of representation, including models. Again, I very quickly showed you, and models that aren't just things standing there on a podium, but that do stuff, that gather, that this sort of standard image of the clients kind of peering at the model, that draw people, as Latour so often says, draw people together around them. So not in that sense only in isolation, although obviously the degree to which I'm doing that is variable. Okay, I don't know. Okay, Molly.
I'm struck by the fact that, and I realize we're looking at static images, and even though you're talking about movement or dynamism, everything is static. You're talking about washware, and I realize you're doing this since 1900. Those caveats being what they are, and it was actually Greg's comment about big data that made me start putting this together. I think it's interesting that, and given Laura's current work, that there's no history there of the fly-through, or of a visualization in that sense, or of a contemporary point where you're dealing with processing, or you're dealing with the work of someone like Marius Waltz, or
right. Well, I certainly would plead guilty to almost all of the above, simply because, I mean, first of all, I showed you two of about 30 images from each week. We would be here till tomorrow morning if we showed you. But yeah, I mean, one has to choose, and I generally would err on the side, because of the level of the course and everything, of relatively canonical or well-known or easily circulated material. On the other hand, and to some extent this is totally dependent on what one can use as reading and so on. So if you write something about some of this that is relevant and useful, happily, it will be at least on the recommended reading list. Anyway, okay, about animation. One of the things that I do like to do, and only, I have to say, maybe some of you guys have tried this too, but the web now provides us with an incredible archive. And so, for example, the movie that was made of the Geddes Highways and Horizons installation at the 1939 World's Fair is actually available online. In the section on dynamism, in order to explain streamlining and industrial design and ergonomics and all those kind of things, I show them a clip from that movie. You're right that logically then one would show a fly-through, because there it's a kind of prototype that the seats are designed so that you move around and it's basically a fly-through. But then one would logically then show a computer fly-through of something. Once I showed an early version, I showed a D-Box thing, which had it actually was D-Box is the website in which they do basically fly-through video for Gary's New York building, in which I'm trying to explain the interrelationship between the cinematic sort of desire and the sort of realism, pseudo-realism of that aesthetic and the marketing functions. Gary's interesting because, and again, this is somewhat heretical, but Gary, if you look at that particular video, it's really interesting. It's fun. I enjoy it. But the first thing it shows is him sketching. They show him making a sketch of the building, and then they show that they take you into the apartment or whatever. And so the question is, what is the sketch under these conditions? I mean, that's one of the questions, and somewhat open-ended. I find Gary's sketches very, very interesting to think about, not as proto-digital or, of course one can construe them as intuiting certain things, but as what is the desire for the sketch in that movie? Why do we need to show a sketch? Beyond the cliche that this is what architects do. And maybe there's nothing there, but I think there is. I can't say that I have fully decoded it, but I would like to. And so that's why the act of drawing is part of that story is of interest to me. Yeah.
Can you? Sorry, I missed the first moment, but could you go a little bit deeper in the reason for history of visualization?
Yeah.
because it's very different than what generally, I think I was very fascinated by this idea that is a history of visualization.
Yeah.
The second point I think related to that, could you go a little bit deeper on the point of the idea of giving informations or setting rules as the idea of defining a project. Because that could also bring perhaps to create another words tunnel in your kind of chronology. Because I think that could, for me, I was very interested in this component, which perhaps has nothing.
Like the giving instructions part. Well, yeah, I mean, not necessarily, you're right.
Not necessarily.
Verbal instructions,
Other, how can I say? So you could also make a history of design, if you want, approaches with no visualization.
That's right.
Involved.
I agree. I'll start with that one. I think it is interesting, and I definitely have thought about it, let's say in a sort of sketchy way, vis-a-vis the whole story. I mean, it could be described in these terms, for example, as sender-receiver circuits. But architect, what is an architect? One could even say that is what an architect is. An architect is a figure who issues commands. That's where that is most literalized, of course, is in the idea of the command. That's why I showed that from the AutoCAD manual. You input the command, do this, do that, and it does this and does that. But what's interesting, then sort of, in terms of the wormhole through history, as you say, is that probably now more than ever, I mean, one can speculate, architects probably write more than ever. I don't mean writing theory about their buildings, I mean offices, one way or the other, as you can see with the BIM thing. Input verbal information, mathematical and verbal information. And of course, working drawings, construction drawings have always had this. And that's, to me, it's a fascinating thing. The writing, that's what a working drawing is. It's a set of commands. It's a set of commands to other humans, by the way. Other humans who perhaps are unionized, for example. And perhaps, therefore, are limited in the set of commands they can follow. Who are in the world, in other words. Or, interestingly, this is an interesting problem with the Shanghai Bank, speak a different language, may not be able to read the writing that's on the paper or on whatever, and require translation or the movement of that from textual to verbal to spoken. So somebody on site tells them do this, and of course there could be a reply back, no, we can't, or this is a problem. So and yes, you could say that that's a sort of trans-historical process. And it's not just scripting or annotation and so on. And I think it would be very interesting to think about. Now, visualization, the fact is, okay, I honestly, I didn't know what to call this course. So we were in Europe. I keep saying that it was on the train between London and New York. And I was discussing this with Neil and my Phyllis now as well, now 9-year-old son, and trying to get advice on what to call the course. And Katarina and I, we went back and forth, and it just sounded better. Honestly, we all agreed basically that was the better term. And it's nothing more profound, or it just couldn't be representation because it was too loaded, too ideological, too dogmatic. And so it seemed that the common denominator here was, at least ideally, as I was explaining it to them, was not like so much the artistic quality of the drawings, although hopefully that comes out. And I certainly had said on and over again to the students, like when Barry's show was up, it would happen to come up at the same time. You must go see LaBruce's good drawings. But people, in other words, that one ought to be able to understand that these are artworks in many cases as well. But I didn't want to, make that the main story. So visualization with a slightly more general technical thing. Of course, if I want to interpret this, what I'm claiming is a off-the-cuff, utilitarian title, analogous to what we were just talking about before, that the ideal form of this course is a history of systems as such, just the systems of visualization without names, without proper names, without Le Corbusier, just the drawings without, now, a la Gideon, sort of anonymous history. Now, just to be sort of responsible about it and say, well, these guys need to know who Le Corbusier, who frankly Wright was. They don't even know much of this stuff. So you could argue that to show a Frank Lloyd Wright plan, for example, it's a different order than the Taylor and Gilbreth diagrams of the bottom. The one is a piece of architectural practice. As such, it's, if you go down to Avery Library now, where those plans now are, it's a work of art that you can't touch, and so whereas the other things are technical documents, manuals, more, belonging to the regimes qua regime of visualization through the ages. You see what I mean? Like, is that what you're...
No, I'm just saying that visualization, visualization for me is a kind of also social and technical
yeah, that's what I mean. That's right, exactly. It's like saying mechanization it's like saying visualization takes command, Right. And in a sense, that is what the course is saying. And this is why when I say I don't do buildings, even the students object. They say, no, architecture is about buildings. Of course it is, but here we're just going to stick to what architects usually, for the most part, actually do. Expand that out as far as we can to writing notes, making slides, and so on. Sorry.
So during the question and answer, is there a moment where they question the raison d'être of the visualization? So why this way of visualization? Because you can choose any kind of visualization at any moment.
Yeah.
But you can choose between different kinds also, and you can select the commands that you want to and the criteria.
Of course. Yeah. Well, you mean why use this technique in my project in studio?
Like during your course?
Yeah.
Is there a moment where they can question the raison d'être? Because there is
of the course or of the project I'm showing?
There is a tool.
Yeah.
There are many tools.
Yes.
That you are showing them. Tools that you are showing them.
Well, I'll try to come up with an example. The disappointing moments, but they're often the most instructive for one as a teacher, is when somebody raises their hand in a room and says, before I came to this Master of Architecture program, I did a Bachelor of Architecture, undergraduate concentration in architecture, in which we were told that you have to be able to hammer a 2x4 into another 2x4 in order to be an architect. And so that's what we did. We built houses. I mean, I literally had those kind of questions. And what you're doing, they were saying to me, is betraying that whole, in a sense, religion, that architecture is in the end a building art, the building art. And I say, yeah, maybe, it may be. So that's the first one, where the very, the kind of implicit idea, or let's say even overdetermined, subtext, visualization takes command. It can be challenged, and it is challenged on that. And then, of course, yes, what are we doing? Upstairs in studio, I'm doing this or that. How do I, should I not use perspective anymore because you've just shown me that it's an AutoCAD function, or whatever.
I meant like political, sometimes the political reasons behind it.
Including that, yes, that's right.
Not just how to build it, but like, in the end, like, you have an agenda sometimes.
Right, the political economy of the drawing, for example. But, these are situated. I must say this is not intended as a course in any way to make recipes, like a kind of cooking course. Like, this is how you should do whatever you're doing in your studio. It hopefully provokes those kind of questions, and I was thinking of, representing movement in this way. Okay, good. Maybe now you know that you're not the first one to have that thought, or that someone else who had this thought in another context thought about it in this way, or that thought was ascribed with this meaning through this medium in this way. Given particular examples. But I actually, more importantly to me, honestly, as a teacher in this case, because basically, just the simple fact of getting at least some kind of historical perspective on the sort of otherwise totally naturalized techniques that are being taught in other classes, to me is enough for now. But what's interesting for me is that this actually has the this is the point of doing it in the first place, has the potential for doing these other things of asking what is my relationship to history, not just to the technique that's on the table, but how does the availability of perspective to me, in a sense, encourage me at some point to think of myself as an historical actor, as participating in histories, as internalizing, receiving, rejecting, for ethical reasons or other reasons, whatever, aesthetic reasons, this or that tradition, this or that process that I may have been aware was underway, or I may not have been aware was underway, and now may be aware of what's underway. The other thing, again, I'd say most underdeveloped, I only hinted at it here, is the idea that there's a big world out there, and the canon is not just about expanding the canon and whatever, but that the very idea of what a canon is a function of a set of techniques that are themselves parochial, which is not the same. I don't mean that term parochial in a necessarily negative way. I mean it as they're limited. They're like from the little village of the Beaux-Arts that circulated around various North American schools and then made its way to China. And encountered other techniques. So that one is, I think that's in a sense the most, for me, if that's the highest reward of the project would be to kind of be able to deliver that problem more critically, which I think would double back on the ethical questions you're asking about. So.
Do you think a plot is a drawing?
You mean like a plot? You mean like a computer plot? A computer plot.
Because you could say, I don't make buildings, I make drawings, but you could also say, I don't make buildings, I plot.
Yeah, sure.
Or like in your submission for the final paper, I upload models to Dropbox.
Yeah, right.
Does that change the visualization topic?
You mean if you say what? If you say,
well, when you say I don't make buildings, I make drawings, which is
architects.
Robert Evans thing. It makes the visual very dominant.
Yes.
If you upload models to Dropbox,
yes,
is visualization more or less central to that? Maybe it's more.
If who? Like the student in the class, or student in a studio? What do you mean? Like
Just you.
Just me personally.
Or your students. I mean, if they're producing a visual material that maybe doesn't live in the drawing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No. In a sense, let me show you. I'll just quote myself. The response to that proposition is at the very beginning here. As a rule, architects don't build, they draw, write, annotate, diagram, model, map, sketch, photograph, animate, and otherwise visualize object spaces and territories. Upload, download, you could add, so on and so on and so on. So it's all of the point is all of the above. Now, whether visualization as a category is adequate for that, as I said, it's somewhat contingent, up for grabs, happily, acknowledge its relative sufficiency there. I don't certainly intend it as a metaphysical, definitive, absolute category. The question, as it were, let's say, success would be measured in the thought, as one is uploading and downloading, that this is historically meaningful. That's like first order of success, that this isn't just in a vacuum, it's just not in the present. It doesn't just anticipate some science fiction future, but it repeats something, or it participates in something. What that is, that particular, it's not, as far as, it participates in that general process of circulation, the kind of Latour thing of immutable mobiles. The questions that it raises, what category of activity it belongs to, is a tip of a very large iceberg. To begin with, I would disagree with Latour in saying what might be important in these exchanges. Let's say, that a Dropbox function is important for the way an office works, either even in the same room or remotely. Some kind of collaboration occurs. he insists on that the fact that the thing remains more or less stable across those transactions, the immutability of the mobile is important, and of course that's true, otherwise the thing will fall apart. I would nevertheless suggest that, a la Shannon Weaver, that the slippages, the offsets, the discrepancies, the mistakes, the noise in those exchanges is structural. I think you would acknowledge it, is maybe of equal interest. How to do that, how to actually teach that, and how to give a reading that explains that is the big challenge, But so I'm satisfied for the moment for the possibility that could be a question, the Dropbox becomes an issue somehow.
It's quite interesting that you're talking about chronology and history and historical, but then what there begins to be a nostalgia for is actually time as a visualization.
Oh, you mean?
Even like, throwing out Piranesi or sort of looking at visualizations that project into the future, or even Gandhi, for example, Gandhi, the Soviet Union, John Stone.
Oh, Gandhi, you're talking Gandhi. Yeah, sure, Gandhi.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So where you have
the ruins, you mean? You mean the Bank of England, yeah.
So when you have time as a mode of visualizing,
yes,
or
the problem of
or even reflecting on the past, right?
Right.
And so that in itself also leads to kind of contemporary practice.
Yeah,
you
sure.
have almost two types of drawings. You have drawings that exist to hold the project in itself, and this is something that we're talking about in the morning, representation, and to have the project itself, right, doesn't exist.
Yeah, I know, right. That's an interesting problem that is definitely front and it's probably more present to us now, and it's especially present in a museum in which what you're seeing are not the buildings themselves, but objects that are represented as themselves. The plots on the wall, the models, all that. They're present in some sense, right? They're not just things you're supposed to see through, as windows onto a final building.
Which in a way is almost a foil to like the plots and the plans and the sections that you produce as visualizations that you come to.
Yeah.
And like Peter Cook has written about this on the book on drawing, and there's the history of this, particular in the UK, and the sort of visionary architecture, which is a term that
No, I know. I know. I very, very quickly alluded to one very kind of episode in that in showing the Unger's drawing, because narrative, the desire, the need to make a drawing tell a story, or make visual materials tell stories. Sometimes rather literally in the case of that drawing by Unger's, but often there are other, some of that visionary stuff like Super Studio, whatever. It's narrative. They call it narrative. Digital is supposed to be post-narrative. In most accounts, narrative is an artifact of the 19th century novel. It's a modern form, not a postmodern form. Postmodern literature is often non-narrative, or at least, beginning with Paul Prier or something like that. It scrambles narrative. Even Joyce, some of the moderns. So that idea about temporality doesn't necessarily square with the from to this, that, A to B type temporality, from the present to the future. So let's call it a conundrum, and a historiographical. I'm happy if it's visible as a conundrum. I don't, one thing I can say vis-a-vis the modernists, let's say in the 20s and 30s, all those obsessions with time and movement. But I use Linda. I don't know if you know Linda Henderson. She's an art historian. She wrote a book called The Fourth Dimension in painting, and she deals with many of these things. It's interesting, there they couldn't ever decide whether pseudoscience, whether the fourth dimension was really, whether time was really a fourth dimension, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, it shows you something about the moment and about the problem for artists, architects, technologists, others, the desire to somehow synthesize, to incorporate change, movement, time. That, in more recent techniques, is with us in maybe even more literal form with animation. But you could even argue that one of the sort of amongst the primary infrastructures of a digital environment today would be the XYZ coordinate. You could, the four-dimensional system, XYZ plus time. That's the sort of framework that's most softwares, I think, still offer, maybe increasingly so to the extent that many softwares can do animation. So, that to denaturalize that, really, that's all I, would like to be able to do. Sort of say, this is an historical artifact. It's not automatic, but this is, in fact, it's somewhat counterintuitive. Because it takes us back to a more linear idea of time. And not even a cinematic idea, because it doesn't even structure in its thinking something like montage. Of course, it allows for montage, but it doesn't. It's not built around montage. Montage, the kind of mixing, like I said, beginning, middle, and end in the animation is, let's say, in the fly-through. I don't know. So, it's counterintuitive vis-a-vis the logic of the software. You see what I'm saying? I mean, basically, the time axis is a historical question. If all of you, each one of you, wrote an article about different moments in the history of the time axis in architectural visualization, we could all teach that together somehow. There's a great rendering from one of the Beaux-Arts catalogs that I use that has Le Temps. The Times, or it's a newspaper, the project, it's one of the Grand Prix projects, the design for a newspaper, headquarters of a newspaper. It's one of those, those are projects. But the interesting thing about Le Temps is that in the project itself is that it's rendered, the sign itself is an electric sign, which is pretty, antithetical to most Beaux-Arts renderings. And the problem of how to draw in the idiom, of the Beaux-Arts idiom, how to draw the evanescence of the light, I think is a beautiful problem. I mean, it captures at least a trace, and of course it's, it's in the word times. That I'm sorry, I don't have the image, but it was even there for the Beaux-Arts, is what I'm saying. And how to draw the shadows, the things that move, the ephemera of architecture. So, the time axis is something, one could do a whole course about the time axis, basically, is what I'm saying. It would be a great course. Maybe, you should do that course. Or write an article or something. Yeah.
We want you to do
Yeah, right. Are we done? Speaking of time.
Yeah.
That's all right. Go ahead. I'm flexible.
I was not distracted.
Go for it.
So I got too distracted.
Yeah.
Many thanks for, I'm looking at this as an extremely interesting exercise of one who wishes to find a way of teaching.
Yes, it's a good
Here you have a class, they are more or less well taught, but they come with the question, I'm an architect. So I was thinking, you have 13 weeks, let's say, do I feel that I'm missing 1 week?
Oh yeah, are you kidding?
Now it comes to my question, what about exhibitions?
Yeah.
Are they act or, are they visualize?
I know.
And I think,
it's a good point. No, for sure. And there is, there's some good literature on them too.
I was thinking.
Yeah, and I do, a little bit. I don't think, if I remember, I don't think I required any of that.
Because over there you can say also curating an
yes,
exhibition.
You're right. No, you're right.
Introducing, that's an important act now.
Yes. Right. No, I was talking with Wallace Miller. Do you know Wallace? She about this because she's writing about she's written about models and exhibitions and some other people. Claire Zimmerman was showing you Claire's article on photography. There are people working on and Claire's working on I think models now too. On even the way that some of these other materials work in exhibitions.
Yeah.
From the full-scale mock-up, for example, you could say that's that's a thing. Yeah, and probably there's not, I don't know, maybe there should be in the ideal version of this thing a bit more on that. I'm trying to think about, well, I'm trying to remember now. I don't
You
think.
don't have to look at it. But
Yeah.
it came to my mind that the exhibition
You're right,
is
no.
a way of, the
Yeah.
visualization is there,
Yeah.
vocab.
Yeah. No, I mean, I show some, sometimes I show some, like I showed, right, like I show, I know. I show the parallel of life and art exhibition.
Yeah.
You know, I just show that quickly. There's a few of those kinds of things. Kepesh does a lot of that kind of thing. And others, you know, in a sense, what I have to say about that I have enjoyed about at least the pedagogical and institutional challenge of doing this kind of thing is that unlike most other, I guess, some of the kind of things I usually teach with advanced seminars in historiography or in particular thematic subjects, it's very tightly constrained. And the question of what really must be in this, and you know, and it's very interesting when you think about it, sort of think out loud, especially with others, and this comes up with the students too sometimes. What about this? What about? Is you could see the branches going in various directions. Ultimately, I mean, whether or not that's ultimately represented here, you know, maybe it could. What I think it implies, which is reassuring to me because it is one of the aims, is that what we call the history of architecture, the way it is normally taught, is a convenient fiction that that in a sense domesticates all those branches and lines them up, you know, more or less usually, and points them in a particular direction, and by, you know, and thereby includes and excludes on that basis. If I were, in a sense, more true to what I claimed even in the beginning of allowing this thing to proliferate in different directions, yeah, you know, then probably, you know, one would have to insist even, not just, you know, represent that side of things, but insist on that, and also on that from the beginning. Not, you know, not just, you know, this is the kind of thing that architects are doing maybe more frequently now, or but it's there. You know, you're right. It's there.